Would you recommend buying analog hardware? Yes and no. It depends what it's for. So if you're mastering, you are always going to get a better sound mastering through analog equipment. It's just, I mean, I have tried and tested countless amounts of times. You always get a far better result working in analog. Obviously, it depends on what sort of equipment you use. I mean, mine's quite an unfair example because the kind of mastering chain that we're running through is like £100,000 worth of equipment, which obviously is going to have a massive difference when comparing it to a £5,000 EQ compressor limiter chain. It's very different. I know from my own experience mastering, the best results come from mastering in analog. I know that when we send tracks back that are mastered in analog, the in that on that chain, for instance, the general the reply we generally get back is, wow, this sounds incredible, it's so smooth, and it's all the telltale signs of great analog equipment. And you know, you're talking about things like Fairchild compressors and Alpha compressors, and they sound unreal. It's unbelievable how good they sound. The digital comparison, the digital kind of plugin, comparing it to the analog, when you compare those, it's there's not a huge difference. It's not like, oh, that sounds totally different. They sound very alike, but it's very clear that that one sounds super smooth and lovely, and that one sounds different. It sounds not as smooth and lovely. So it all depends on where you're using this analog hardware. Mastering, yes, 100% go down the analog route. Mixing, on the other hand, I mean, I mix on an Avid S4, all digital, all in the box using plugins. And the reason I do this is basically because A, I'm working in Atmos, but B as well is that I can use multiple instances. And that 5% difference between analog and hardware over the course of a mix where you're using multiple pieces of equipment, the difference is minimal. It's nothing. And if anything, I actually, and I know this from personal experience, I know I get better mixes mixing in the box, in Atmos, bearing in mind I'm working in Atmos, folding down to stereo. So it's very different to someone mixing in stereo. If I was mixing in stereo, I would mix in analog, because I'd use an analog summing console, and that I ultimately do get a better sound than anyone mixing in stereo. But I'm not. I'm mixing in Atmos, and the difference with mixing in Atmos is I can create a far superior sound than anyone can create in stereo, albeit I'm folding it down and printing as stereo as well. So I've got a massive advantage on what I can achieve in a stereo mix compared to someone mixing on, let's say, an SSL console. I mean, I sold my SSL to install an Avid S4 because it's so superior, and I've tested this time and time again, and it's night and day. It really is. The other thing is tracking, and I know you can track with zero latency plugins now, interfaces, DSP, all that stuff. But you are going to maybe want to bear in mind that tracking through, you know, a proper preamp, a really good external preamp, that's going to make a big difference. A compressor going in, things like that. Especially if you're tracking vocals and you've got a really nice vocal chain, that's going to do, like buying analog, is going to do a world of difference for that. But going back to mixing, I feel that the pros of working in the box are that you have the ability to use multiple instances. And if I had the choice of one compressor that's really good. Or I've got the difference of having, let's say, 10 of that same compressor, but a plug-in emulation of it. And there's only 5% difference or 10% difference. It's a very, very slight difference. I'm going to opt for the plug-in because I can use multiple instances, and I'm not. The thing with it is that computers these days. I mean, I've got an M1 Mac Studio here. I can run literally as many plugins as I want. I never max out my CPU. I'm not limited in the way that we used to be. I'm in no way limited by my plugin usage. I can use whatever plugins I want, and I can use these however I want. I'm not confined to one instance anymore, so I can use whatever I want in chains, and it's far better, and it doesn't limit you. So the fact that you're not limited, you can just do whatever you want when it comes to mixing. And at the end of the day, the great thing with mixing in the box and mixing with digital plugins is that it's recall. If you've got to recall that session, let's say you've got to recall that session 6 months down the line, you could have sold a piece of hardware. You could have, changed the patching or something. Something could have happened with a certain piece of hardware, and you haven't got access to it anymore. And you're like, damn, you can't use it. But plugins, it's always going to load up where it left off, which is brilliant. The other thing is obviously cost. I mean, plugins, you're talking the majority of plugins these days. When you go on Plugin Alliance, you can get plugins for $29. $29 for a plugin, compared to you're talking like $4,000 for the real hardware, and it's maybe 5-10% difference. I mean, unless you made a money and you can go and spend ridiculous amounts of money on hardware, great. You don't need all this hardware for mixing, because once spanned across the whole mix, it's very, very minimal, the difference you would get. And I know that more than anyone, because I've tested all these things. I've tested the comparison between the two. I would never have sold my SSL console and fitted an S4 and work completely in the box for mixing if it wasn't a superior sound. The other thing to bear in mind as well with regards to analog hardware is it's the hands-on approach. The fact that you have a physical piece of hardware that you're turning every dial, and it's that hands-on approach that does actually get you a better sound. But when you've got a controller such as the S4, all that hands-on control isn't factored into anything, because you've got all that hands-on control with with the analog, with the digital plugin. So you have all that analog control, and having that control does make a massive difference. If I had to work with a mouse and keyboard, for instance, I would never get the same results as I do working on my Avid S4, and that's partly because when I'm hands-on with anything you're hands-on with, you work better, you work more efficiently, and you work more intuitively with what you're working on, and it's massively important. That's one thing that if you haven't got a controller like the S4, for instance, that's one thing that the analog has that the digital doesn't. When you're using a mouse and keyboard, you don't feel the resistance of a pot. You don't jump around parameters in the same way. It's like when I'm EQing, I'm on 2 parameters at a time, and I'm jumping around an EQ on the S4 just like I do on an analog piece of hardware. So yeah, it depends on where you're, what process. And I will always say, and I will stand by this: analog mastering far superior to digital mastering. Mixing, I would always now mix in the box in Dolby Atmos and fold down to stereo. It just achieves a far better result. Tracking, I would always, personally, I would track with a great external mic preamp. I'm not so much, when it comes to tracking, I'm not keen on tracking with EQ and compression going in, mainly because I like to record with a dry signal. If I ever record, I like to record with a dry signal, and then I can always process after. I don't like to print and record a process signal that's, let's say, compressed into the box and then not be able to process that afterwards. Because the thing with, if you record it in dry, no compression for instance, you can then process that afterwards to achieve whatever you want. And if you want to change it, you can change it. Problem with, if you print it in, it's hard printed, it's there and it can't be changed. So yeah, I think that answers the question. Yeah, keep your questions coming in, and I'll do my best to answer them.